Hello everybody, before we dive into today's video, just wanted to briefly mention today's video is brought to you by the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts, where I am presently in the Richardson wing of the absolutely gorgeous Thomas Crane Public Library. The city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of America's founding fathers, and both of whom were pivotal to an insane number of elements of the United States' rise and development, as well as were a part of some rather interesting and oft-forgotten stories along the way, such as that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplace of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls that they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history and present-day adventures and experiences, from the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and architectural elegance of the old City Hall and this very Thomas Crane Library. There's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene, with an array of global and local flavors. It's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. When one pictures the first British settlers coming to what would become the United States, it's generally of a group of religiously oppressed, rigidly pious individuals, such as the famed, now named Pilgrim separatist group in their black and white clothing and top hats featuring giant buckles, a group the Native Americans saved by sharing food and teaching them how to farm certain things in the region in their first year in Massachusetts, all culminating in the first Thanksgiving in America. But in truth, the clothing style often depicted in paintings of the Pilgrims bore little resemblance to what the Pilgrims actually seemed to wear. For example, we know from ship manifests that the Pilgrim's garb was extremely colorful, and buckles were both expensive and not yet fully in fashion, as they would become later in the 17th century when paintings of the Pilgrims started to be made, leading us all astray on what they typically wore. Further, while the Pilgrims did receive a measure of aid in the early going from the Native Americans in the region, they did not celebrate the first Thanksgiving in America, and the event today the modern holiday is supposedly based on wasn't even the Pilgrims' first Thanksgiving in America, nor did they initially think to invite the Native Americans to the event in question, though a group of them, probably attracted by all the noisy games like shooting contests, did ultimately join the party. Even popular perception of what they supposedly ate during said event is less based in history and more mostly thanks to Sarah Josepha Hale, author of the nursery rhyme Mary Had a Little Lamb, and one of the most influential women in American history who, through her highly circulated editorials, laid out a partially mythical and romanticized version of the events most know today and popularized it. She also is a huge reason Thanksgiving is a national holiday in the United States in the first place, from her decades-long efforts to make it so. But we're not here to discuss Sarah Hale and her massive influence on United States culture that still echoes through today, nor even the separatist group now called the Pilgrims per se, though William Bradford and his cohorts, along with the non-separatist Puritans later, do come into play. No, today we're going to discuss someone who came over to the future United States around the same time as these groups and had a rather different view of the world than his puritanical compatriots, and presents yet another poignant example in several ways of the fact that how we view these early settlers in popular history is riddled with myths, misconceptions, and a whole lot of nuance thrown in. As ever, the devil is in the details, so let's dive into it all, shall we? Our story today begins in Devon, England, with the birth of one Thomas Morton in 1576. A man described by famed Harvard historian and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Bernard Bailyn as one of the strangest, most flamboyant, and most belligerent, impious people ever to wander into the coastal scene, nature lover, pleasure seeker, and Rabelaisian celebrant of secular rights. Not much is known of Morton's early life other than he appears to have been from a comfortably affluent background as the son of a soldier. Morton also ultimately studied law before becoming enamored with America. While the Mayflower and the Pilgrims had more famously crossed the Big Blue to settle in present-day Massachusetts in 1620, Morton came 2 years later, not so much with the intention initially of immigrating to the New World, but on something of a reconnaissance mission for Sir Fernando Gorges, the so-called father of English colonization in North America, to scout the region. What he found there was a beautiful land rich with resources. He noted,
"The land seemed paradise. The more I looked, the more I liked it. Goodly groves of trees, dainty fine round rising hillocks, delicate fair large plains, sweet crystal fountains, and clear running streams. Nature's masterpiece, her chiefest magazine of all where lives her store. If this land be not rich, then is the whole world poor?
As for the recent European imports, however, he had a much lesser opinion, noting he felt the natives were
most full of humanity and more friendly than the other.
He would later illustrate of the Algonquin peoples he encountered and in subsequent trips get to know well,
they are willing that anyone shall eat with them. Nay, if anyone shall come into their houses and there fall asleep, when they see him disposed to lie down, they will spread a mat for him of their own accord. If he sleep until their meat be dished up, they will set a wooden bowl of meat by him that slept, and wake him, saying, Kadap keen mekin, that is, if you be hungry, there is meat for you, where if you will eat, you may. Such is their humanity. They love not to be encumbered with many utensils, and although every proprietor knows his own, yet all things, so long as they will last, are used in common among them. A biscuit cake given to one, that breaks it equally into so many parts as there are persons in his company and distributes it. According to human reason, guided only by the light of nature, these people lead the more happy and freer life, being void of care, which torments the minds of many Christians. They are not delighted in baubles, but in useful things. They are so loving also that they make use of those things they enjoy, the wife only excepted, as common goods, and are therein so compassionate that, rather than one should starve through want, they would starve all. Thus do they pass away the time merrily, not regarding our pomp, which they see daily before their faces, but are better content with their own, which some men esteem so meanly of.
He goes on noting the idea that Europeans were better off on the whole than these peoples was false in his opinion, stating,
Now since it is but food and raiment that men that live needeth, though not all alike, why should not the natives of New England be said to live richly, having no want of either? Clothes are the badge of sin, and the more variety of fashions is but the greater abuse of the creature. The beasts of the forest there do serve to furnish them at any time when they please. Fish and flesh they have in great abundance, which they both roast and boil. Plato's Commonwealth is so much practiced by these people.
Needless to say, he liked what he saw in both the lands and the people there, outside of the other European colonists at the time. Not dissuaded with who he would be sharing the land with on the European side of things, after a few months scouting the area, he returned to England and found a different group to settle with, partnering on a business venture with Richard Wollaston, noted pirate, sea captain, and otherwise, let's just say, not exactly someone who held to Puritan or separatist ideals. This brings us to Merrymount, the original European settlement in the present-day Quincy, Massachusetts region. The area was originally called Passamaquoddy, meaning Little Neck of Land by the Native Americans, then later Mount Wollaston after the aforementioned captured Richard Wollaston. Morton and Wollaston and 30 indentured servants initially established a trading post on this hill in Quincy Bay in 1624, about 30 miles from the Plymouth colony, with the group beginning to trade with the natives for furs and the like, and soon after trying to make a proper colony out of it all, farming on a small tract of land that had been previously cleared by the natives.
As for Captain Wollaston, it's sometimes alleged his unscrupulous ways were a little too far out there for Morton, supposedly with a disagreement about shipping off indentured servants to Cape Ann in Virginia, ultimately causing Morton to get the group to oust Wollaston.
Noteworthy on this, indentured servants were pretty much bound to do whatever the individual who held their contract wanted them to do, and they could typically be bought and sold and otherwise functioned in practice like slaves with little protections, at least for the duration of their contract. This was, however, not considered slavery because it was, in theory at least, voluntarily agreed to or sometimes via court order as punishment for some crime. But either way, it also had an end date. In practice, however, it was functionally little different than slavery when it came to day-to-day matters. The indentured individual was at the whims of their master, not allowed to leave their service until released or their contract up. Their contract could, once again, also be bought, sold, or traded without their consent. They were also not allowed to marry without their master's consent, and pregnancy tended to see the female indentured servant's term extended. And of course, depending on the master, the servant could be extremely harshly treated or malnourished with little of anything they could do about it. In the British American colonies, individuals tended to become indentured servants for typically 1 to 7 years in exchange for the price of passage across the Big Blue to the New World. On the other end of their service, they were also sometimes given some land, food, as much as a year's worth, and clothing. During the contract, much like an apprentice, they also often were taught a trade like farming. Going back to the length of the deal though, those who came voluntarily and were already highly skilled, healthy, and with some education tended to see shorter terms, and those on the other end of the spectrum longer. Most who chose to come were predominantly young men and women looking for better prospects abroad, with the deals often arranged by their parents. In this, they'd seek out a ship captain willing to transport and feed these young men and women during the voyage in exchange for being able to sell their agreed-upon indentured servant contract on the other side to someone in the colonies, or, in the case of Morton and Wollaston, use them in their trading post, at least initially before Wollaston sold some of them off. As for the savings here, it's noted that if one were to pay their way across at the time, it was typically about 2 to 3 years worth of a typical laborer's salary in Britain. Thus, agreeing to go be someone's servant for the most common of around 4 or 5 years or so was not a bad exchange for many who couldn't otherwise afford such a trip, especially when the prospects on the other side of the contract potentially included land of your own to work after. That is, if you survived the length of the contract, which in the early going, between the harsh conditions, eventual occasional native attacks in some regions and the like, let's just say many did not make it to the end of their term, and to an extent, as the contract was near up, there was little incentive to the holder of the contract to make sure the individual did make it to the end of their contract, given the provisions and potential land and the like that needed given to them on the other side.
However they got there, it's noted that over half of all of those Europeans who immigrated to the 13 British colonies in the 17th and early 18th centuries immigrated as indentured servants, with these numbers only declining once the slave trade picked up. But in the beginning, at least, in the British colonies, indentured servants were the solution for a massive labor shortage, and Morton and Wollaston took advantage of the system for their little venture. However, when Wollaston started selling some of them off to other colonies, Morton allegedly took issue with this. Whether any such disagreement or not in truth, however, Wollaston did depart for Virginia only about a year after helping to establish the trading post, and took some of the indentured servants with him, as well as apparently died not long after, on March the 17th, 1826, according to one Captain John Bennington, who wrote to the Duke of Buckingham of Wollaston's death.
In any event, after Wollaston departed Mount Wollaston, according to the aforementioned governor of the Plymouth colony, William Bradford, Morton staged something of a coup against a man named Fitcher who Wollaston had left behind in charge. Bradford claims Morton said to the many indentured servants,
"You see that many of your fellows are carried to Virginia, and if you stay, you will also be carried away and sold for slaves with the rest. I, having a part in the plantation, will receive you as my partners and consociates. So may you be free from service, and we will converse, trad, plant, and live together as equals, and support and protect one another."
Whatever the case and the details on all of this, after Wollaston departed, Morton renamed the place Mount Mary, or Merrymount, something of a triple entendre naming, after Mary, Mother of God, also Latin for the sea, Mare, and finally being Mary, with it also sometimes insinuated the Mount part had a double meaning as well. Naturally, having a place partially named after being happy and having a good time immediately rubbed the puritanical separatists the wrong way. Of this, Bradford would claim immediately after Morton took over,
"They then fell to utter licentiousness and led a dissolute and profane life. Morton became lord of Misrule and maintained, as it were, a school of atheism. As soon as they acquired some means by trading with the Indians, they spent it in drinking wine and strong drinks to great excess, as some reported 10 pounds worth in a morning."
Given the friction between them, Morton would later lament the Plymouth settlers were, to quote,
"threatening to make it a woeful mount and not a Merrymount."
Morton's views on the region were simply in stark contrast to the Puritans and their idea of a new Israel or holy city on the hill for the rest of the world to look to. For example, where the rigidly religious colonists saw the natives as lesser and potential enemies, Morton admired them and had more interest in integrating and intermarrying his little colony with their people and creating a new combined American society. Meanwhile, the separatists and later non-separatist Puritans at various points outlawed gaming, instituted up to capital punishment for adultery, fines celebrating Christmas, instituted a rule that if you miss Sunday service, you could potentially be put in the stocks. The list goes on and on and on. As H.L. Mencken stated, Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. While at the same time, Morton was busy trying to woo the native women to come join the colony and otherwise allegedly, with his group, making money hand over fist in trade and enjoying it and the fruits of the land to an extreme degree. In all, the Puritans saw the land and their journey to it as an errand into the wilderness and to create a city on the hill for the rest of the world to look to, and felt God will bless their colony if they did so. Morton's idea for the colony was more to try to resurrect a closer tie to nature and a merging of cultures, in a nutshell, to try to reestablish the idealized mythical merry old England. Needless to say, Morton's colony rubbed the other settlers the wrong way and posed a major threat to what they were trying to do long-term in the region. Things only got worse when Morton's very friendly relations with the natives started undercutting the Plymouth settlers' trade, most notably because of his willingness to trade guns for the sought-after native goods. Bradford would state,
Morton, hearing what profit the French and the fishermen had made by trading guns, powder, and shot to the Indians, began to practice it hereabouts, teaching them how to use them. Having instructed them, he employed some of them to hunt and fowl for him, until they became far more able than the English, owing to their swiftness on foot and nimbleness of body, being quick-sighted, and knowing the haunts of all sorts of game, with the result that, when they saw what execution a gun would do, and the advantage of it, they were mad for them, and would pay any price for them, thinking their bows and arrows but baubles in comparison.
This was seen as a problem not only because the natives weren't really willing to trade as much in other items anymore, but also for the perceived threat to the Plymouth colony if the natives suddenly wanted to turn those guns against the settlers. Morton, however, seemed to have no such concern, and in the general case was more interested in intermarrying and intermingling the native cultures with his own group than to have any conflict with them. As Charles Francis Adams Jr. would sum up when editing a 19th century edition of Morton's New English Canon published about the region and events,
Now, although the neighboring settlers were Puritan and separatists, they were also poor men and shrewd dealers, eager to turn an honest penny in the way of trade. And they by no means fancied being driven out of the market in this wise. But more than this, they had come into New England to stay. They were not mere adventurers on the shore of a savage land, seeking, regardless of whether ultimate consequences, at once to secure whatever they could extract from it. They were here with their wives and their little children, living at best in feeble communities on the outskirts of the forest or, in the case of Morton's immediate neighbors, as solitary families or single individuals. To men thus situated, the presence of such a reckless gang as Morton's was more than an annoyance. It was a menace.
Bradford would go on all this.
Morton, having taught the natives the use of guns, sold them all he could spare, and he and his associates determined to send for large supplies from England, having already sent over a score by some of the ships. This being known, several members of the scattered settlements hereabouts agreed to solicit the settlers at Plymouth Colony, who then outnumbered them all, to join with them to prevent the further growth of this mischief and to suppress Morton and his associates.
Once banded together over the matter, Bradford and co. demanded Morton cease trading in guns, claiming that it was illegal to do so. The lawyer Morton fired back, denying this was true, with Charles Francis Adams Jr. noting of this that Morton,
at least, showed himself in this dispute better versed in the law of England than those who admonished him.
Specifically, there was a proclamation against doing such by King James I, but this was never made law beyond this proclamation, and the king had recently died. Thus, in Morton's view, seemingly correctly, the proclamation wasn't valid anymore, and so it was that he ignored the demands to cease trading in weapons.
Things finally came to a head thanks to a rather curious European tradition of having a party around a maypole. As to the origins of this practice, it isn't clear today and potentially goes back even before medieval times, possibly centered around the old Germanic practices of having sacred trees. But all of this has been lost to history. The point is, by the 17th century, while the rise of the Protestants had started to see the practice banned in some regions, even described in a Parliament ordinance of 1644 as a heathenish vanity generally abused to superstition and wickedness, the Maypole was otherwise a mainstay of May Day gatherings in parts of Britain and beyond. And given rising attitudes against it at the time, it would seem for some it became something of a symbol for rejecting Protestant powers.
In a nutshell, on the Maypole, it was simply a giant pole made from a large cut tree that would be erected and decorated in various ways, such as being adorned with flowers, and much later in history, ribbons and the like. In some sense, this was somewhat akin to decorating a Christmas tree, but instead of candies and food items and the like, as was tradition with Christmas trees in the early going, the Maypole would be decorated with elements to signify spring had sprung. In some communities, the pole would remain up year-round in the town, and others only put up for the specific celebration. But as you can imagine, with people in the dangerous state of enjoying themselves, the puritanical separatists and Puritans of the region were not happy about Morton erecting a Maypole and the typical raucous celebration with it. Morton would describe his little colony's May 1st, 1627 celebration, stating,
"The inhabitants of Merrymount did devise amongst themselves to have revels, and merriment after the old English custom, and therefore brewed a barrel of excellent beer, and provided a case of bottles to be spent, with other good cheer, for all comers of that day. And upon May Day they brought the Maypole to the place appointed, with drums, guns, pistols, and other fitting instruments, for that purpose. And there erected it with the help of savages, that came thither of purpose to see the manner of our revels. A goodly pine tree of 80 foot long was reared up, with a pair of buck's horns nailed on, somewhat near unto the top of it, where it stood as a fair sea mark for directions, how to find out the way to mine host of Merrymount."
Unlike with the Plymouth colony's more famous Thanksgiving celebration, Morton actually did invite the local Native Americans to the party before it started, not the least of which because he hoped some Native women would come and liven the party up even more for his colony of otherwise exclusively men. For example, he would write in 1637 in his The New English Canon, which was meant both as an informational book covering everything from agriculture to philosophy, and in all a bit of an attack on the Puritan colonists who'd given him the boot, the lyrics of a song they sung around the Maypole, which included such lines as,
"Lasses in beaver coats come away, ye shall be welcome to us night and day. Drink, and be merry, merry, merry boys. Let all your delight be in the Hymen's joys. So to the Hymen, now the day is come, about the merry Maypole take a room."
To which Morton states the entire thing was sung with
every man bearing his part, which they performed in a dance, hand in hand about the Maypole.
Morton would sum up of the party,
"This harmless mirth made by young men, that lived in hope to have wives brought over to them, that would save them a labor to make a voyage to fetch any over, was much distasted of the precise separatists that keep much ado about the tithe of mint and cumin, troubling their brains more than reason would require about things that are indifferent, and from that time sought occasion against my honest host of Merrymount to overthrow his undertakings and to destroy his plantation quite and clean."
Bradford naturally had a very different view of the whole affair and would sum up on his side in his Of Plymouth Plantation,
They set up a Maypole, drinking and dancing about it many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many fairies, or furies rather, and worse practices, as if they had anew revived and celebrated the feasts of the Roman goddess Flora, or the beastly practices of the mad Bacchanalians. Morton, likewise, to show his poetry, composed sundry rhymes and verses, some tending to lasciviousness, and others to the detraction and scandal of some persons, which he affixed to this idle Maypole. They changed also the name of their place, and instead of calling it Mount Wollaston, they called it Merrymounted, as if this jollity would have lasted ever. Even sodomy and buggery, things fearful to name, have broke forth in this land oftener than once.
The following year, in 1628, Morton and Company did it again, but the Puritan colonists had had enough of Morton, his perceived sinful antics, his alleged carnal associations with the natives, and, most of all, his trading guns with them. With all of this seen as a major threat to the other settlers in the region in a variety of ways, Miles Standish, who Morton called Captain Shrimp because of his diminutive height, and others marched on the little colony and arrested Morton. Bradford would later describe the arrest.
Morton defended himself stiffly, closed his doors, armed his associates, and had dishes of powder and bullets ready on the table. and if they had not been overarmed with drink, more harm might have been done. They summoned him to yield, but they got nothing but scoffs from him. At length, fearing Standish and his men would wreck the house, some of his crew came out, intending not to yield, but to shoot. But they were so drunk that their guns were too heavy for them. Morton himself, with a carbine, overcharged and almost half filled with powder and shot, tried to shoot Captain Standish. But he stepped up to him and put aside his gun and took him. No harm was done on either side.
Morton's account of the entire affair was slightly different, noting,
The separatists of Plymouth County, envying the prosperity and hope of the plantation at Merrymount, which they perceived began to come forward and to be in a good way for gain in the beaver trade, conspired together against mine host especially, who was the owner of that plantation, and made up a party against him and mustered up what aid they could, accounting of him as of a great monster. They found mine host at Wessagusset because mine host was a man that endeavored to advance the dignity of the Church of England, which they, on the contrary part, would labor to vilify with uncivil terms, inveighing against the sacred Book of Common Prayer, and mine host that used it in a laudable manner amongst his family, arrested him. Much rejoicing was made that they had gotten their capital enemy, whom they purposed to hamper in such sort that he should not be able to uphold his plantation at Merrymount. They began to drink to celebrate, got drunk, and fell asleep, after which mine host escaped to Merrymount. The word which was given with an alarm was, "Oh, he's gone! He's gone! What shall we do? He's gone!" The rest, half asleep, started up in a maze, and like rams, ran their heads one at another full butt in the dark. Their grand leader, Captain Shrimp Standish, took on most furiously and tore his clothes for anger to see the empty nest and their bird gone.
Finally, returning to Merrymount, the group armed themselves as Bradford had described, and later Morton claims he negotiated his surrender on the condition that no one, not even himself, would be harmed. However, he claims,
No sooner had set open the door and issued out, but instantly Captain Shrimp and the rest of the worties stepped to him, laid hold of his arms, and had him down. And so eagerly was every man bent against him, not regarding any agreement made with such a carnal man, that they fell upon him as if they would have eaten him. Some of them were so violent that they would have a slice with scabbard, and all for haste, until an old soldier, of the Queen's, as the proverb is, that was there by accident, clapped his gun under the weapons and sharply rebuked these worthies for their unworthy practices.
after a brief trial in Plymouth, Morton was exiled to the Isle of Shoals with no provisions given. If he happened to die there, well, no blood on their hands. Instead, however, some friendly Native Americans brought him food and the like, and ultimately, in September of 1628, a passing English ship picked him up and took him back to England. As for the colony Morton left behind, Bradford would write,
But this continued not long, for after Morton was sent for England, shortly after came over that worthy gentleman, Mr. John Endicott, who brought a patent under the broad seal for the government of Massachusetts, who, visiting those parts, caused the Maypole to be cut down, and rebuked them for their profanes, and admonished them to look there should be better walking. So they now, or others, changed the name of their place again, and called it Mount Dagon.
As for this new name, Dagon was the god of the Philistines, whose temple, the biblical story goes, Samson destroyed as his last act on earth, symbolizing the Puritans similarly destroying Merrymount. Also, as a fun aside, unlike Bradford, who called Endicott that worthy gentleman, Morton would later call him
That great swelling fellow, Captain Littleworth.
Back in England, the home court saw little issue with Morton's conduct in America, and he otherwise faced no further consequences for any of it at this time. As such, within a year he returned to his former colony, but found both its residents scattered and the religious influence in the region having significantly increased with the number of recent imports of Puritans. And so it was that only about a year after his return, Morton was arrested in September of 1630. In this case, he claims after he refused to sign a document more or less making the Bible's words through the lens of the Puritans' belief the law he would adhere to. His sentence at his trial was laid down thus:
Ordered that Thomas Morton of Mount Wollaston shall presently be set in the bilbows, and after sent prisoner into England by the ship called the Gift, now returning thither, that all his goods shall be seized upon to defray the charge of his transportation, payment of his debts, and to give satisfaction to the Indians for a canoe he unjustly took away from them, and that his house, after the goods are taken out, shall be burnt down to the ground in sight of the Indians for their satisfaction, for many wrongs he hath done them from time to time.
After this, Merrymount was burned to the ground. Once again deported to England, this time Morton did briefly spend time in Essex jail, but was soon let out. At this point, he decided to fight back using his legal expertise in a series of lawsuits, setting about doing his utmost to get the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter revoked. His hope was then to be able to return to Merrymount without the Puritans or separatists able to dictate anything to him this time around. Simultaneously, he also attempted to get his own charter and most notably set about writing the aforementioned, the New English Canon in 1637, often claimed to be the first book ever banned in America. Of this book, John Adams would later write in a letter to Thomas Jefferson on October 12, 1812,
"The design of the writer appears to have been to promote two objects. One, to spread the fame and exaggerate the advantages of New England. Two, to destroy the characters of the English inhabitants and excite the government to suppress the Puritans and send over settlers in their stead from among the Royalists and the disciples of Archbishop Laud."
Ultimately, while Morton did get traction against the Puritans in courts and popular sentiment among some groups, political swirlings of the time in England culminated in the English Civil War in 1642, thwarting all such efforts. A year later, in 1643, the 68-year-old Morton once again made the jaunt across the Big Blue to return to his beloved New England. However, in the interim of his last time in the colonies, some 20,000 or so more Puritans had arrived in the region. And as you might imagine, his past history there, as well as his efforts to get the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter revoked and otherwise bad-mouthing them so publicly after in his book, Morton was relatively quickly arrested for sedition and being a royalist agitator, having made, to quote, "a complaint against us to the Royal Privy Council and set forth a book against us," both of which were true, though as there was no copy of the New English Canon in New England, this one could not be proved. Thus, in 1644, he found himself sitting in a jail in Boston where he spent the winter awaiting further evidence to arrive from Europe against him. However, time in the clink, rather poor treatment while there, and being of a rather seasoned number of years old didn't suit, and his health rapidly declined. With no further evidence against him forthcoming from England at this point, instead of continuing with charges against him, his captors simply fined him £100 and then let him go. Governor John Winthrop would explain their reasoning.
"He was a charge to the country, for he had nothing, and we thought not fit to inflict corporal punishment upon him, being old and crazy, but thought better to fine him and give him his liberty, as if it had been to procure his fine, but indeed to leave him opportunity to go out of the jurisdiction, as he did soon after."
Of this leaving, his final almost 2 years on this spaceship we call Earth were spent quietly in Maine, where he died in 1647 at the age of 71. In the aftermath of his second exile to England, Morton's former little trading post and colony became part of Boston in 1634, and then in 1640, part of Braintree. After the American Revolution, most of the original Mount Wollaston became part of Quincy, which was named after Colonel John Quincy, the grandfather of Abigail Adams. The area that was Merrymount also all the way up through the early 20th century belonged to the Adams family before being commercially developed and sold off, including, most notably, a man by the name of Howard Johnson building the very first Howard Johnson's there in 1925, with this first location a pharmacy. He later, of course, expanded into restaurants and hotels. As for the Adams' ownership of what was Merrymount, Charles Francis Adams Jr. points out that while Miles Standish's actions began the end of Merrymount, Standish's chief rival for the heart of one Priscilla Alden, John Alden, who would win her away from Standish, would go on to have a granddaughter named Hannah Bass, who ultimately married one Joseph Adams of Braintree, with their descendants ultimately owning Mount Wollaston. Adams concludes,
"There one of them now resides close to where Morton's Maypole stood. It thus happens that while Miles Standish, with ignominious violence, expelled from his home the first master of Merrymount, The last master of Merrymount traces a descent from Miles Standish's successful rival.
The Maypole of Merrymount would eventually be immortalized thanks to a 19th century fictional story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, not coincidentally titled The Maypole of Merrymount, about a 17th century British colony in Guernsey where a newlywed couple, Edgar and Edith, dance around a maypole only to see the event squashed thanks to one John Endicott and the Puritans cutting down the maypole, whipping the inhabitants, dressing them in puritanical clothing, and cutting Edgar's hair in a pumpkin shell style, as you do.
Further, the city of Quincy's official seal features the original trading post site, and here in Maypole Hill Park, there stands a marker where Morton's Maypole once stood.